Hello, good afternoon from the SEAMEO Regional Center for Archaeology and Fine Arts in Bangkok to all of our viewers joining us live on Facebook and on Zoom. Every year on 8th of March is International Women's Day, which is a global day celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. Therefore, for International Women's Day 2023, hashtag IWD 2023, SEAMEOSPAFA would like to recognize the immense contribution women make to Southeast Asian cultural heritage by speaking to three remarkable female guests in today's SPAFA sesh who have devoted their careers in this field. But before we formally introduce you to our special guests, we would like to invite our Facebook viewers and Zoom attendees joining us for this live broadcast to let us know which country and/or institution you are joining us from. Also, we do not hand out certificates for our SPAFA sessions, but instead, we encourage active participation from our viewers and attendees by submitting questions and comments, which we will respond to during the Q&A part of the SPAFA sesh. If you are joining us on Facebook, leave your questions and comments in the comment box under the live feed. And for those joining this SPAFA sesh on Zoom, please leave your questions in the Q&A tab only. And through your questions and comments, you stand the chance to be chosen as the lucky winners for a SPAFA souvenir. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce you to the moderator of today's SPAFA sesh, who herself is a remarkable female in the field of Southeast Asian Southeast Asian cultural heritage, as she is the president of the Myanmar Archaeology Association and has worked at UNESCO Myanmar, and who is now senior researcher with us at SEAMEOSPAFA. Please join me in welcoming Ohnmar Myo.
Thank you, John. Yeah,
Welcome, Ohnmar.
A very good afternoon from SEAMEOSPAFA Bangkok. Warmly welcome to you all. My name is Ohnmar Myo, and I'll be serving as a moderator for this 27th SPAFA sesh. I'm honored to have the brilliant speakers today who are renowned women experts in Southeast Asia cultural heritage field. As you already know, this sesh is the special event to commemorate the International Women's Day, which falls on the 8th of March every year. In this session, celebrating women working in Southeast Asian cultural heritage, challenges and opportunities, you will be hearing the three presentations. And the first one will be from Dr. Paritta Chalermpow Koanantakool, former director of Princess Mahachakri Siritorn Anthropology Center and UNESCO expert on intangible cultural heritage. The second presentation will be from Dr. Charlotte Galloway, Honorary Associate Professor of Australian National University. And the third speaker is Dr. Heidi, lecturer in Curating and Museology, School of Arts from SOAS University of London. So each presentation will last about 20 minutes. Now, moving along to our session, please welcome Professor Dr. Paritta, and she will be sharing her experience as a women anthropologist, documenting female folk artists in two fields with us. Before the presentation, may I introduce briefly to you to Dr. Paritta. She taught anthropology at Thammasat University from 1981 to 2002, and her research interests included performing arts and artists, community-based museums, included performing arts and artists, and heritage studies. From 2002 to 2011, Dr. Paritta was the director of Princess Mahachakri Siritorn Anthropology Center, where she spearheaded a research and capacity building program, engaging with community-based museums all over Thailand. Dr. Paritta also initiated the SAC projects dealing with the transmission and documentation of cultural heritage. Since 2012, she has been facilitating UNESCO workshops on intangible cultural heritage in many countries in Asia and the Pacific region. She is currently enjoying a quiet retirement with her cat and her painting. May I respectfully invite Ajahn Paritta for your presentation. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Ohnmar, for your kind introduction. And also thanks to SPAFA for inviting me to speak. Now, let me see if I can show you some images. All right. Can you see it?
Is it a woman anthropologist?
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
okay.
the one.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, so I'd like to start the presentation by talking about two ladies, female folk artists, whom I've met during my fieldwork, which is a research about performing art in Thailand. I'm sorry, I cannot. Oh, yes. Well, I did two fieldworks that allowed me to meet these two ladies. The first one took place long time ago in 1976 when I was a graduate student in a British university in social anthropology, studying puppet tradition or shadow play in southern Thailand. I was based in a small town, a market town called Hua Sai in the province of Nakhon Si Thammarat on the east coast of southern Thailand. And I'm sorry, I can't advance the slide. Okay. So this is what the performance looks like. There is it takes place in a small theater, and the puppeteer is the one who manipulates the puppets, and he sings and he speaks on behalf of all the characters in the story, and he's the one who gives cue to the musician to play the music. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So this is a sketch of what a small theater, which is about 2 meters wide by 1.5 meters deep, looks like. In front of the theater is a white screen with a microphone hanging from above, and the 2 rows of puppets on both sides of the theater. Next, please. And performances take place at night. In 1976, it usually started about 8 o'clock and then continue until about midnight. And then there will be about an hour break. And then it continues again from 1 o'clock to about 4 o'clock. So it's a nighttime performance, and the audience would be sitting usually on the ground, really, in front of the screen. Next, please. The troupe, next slide, please. The troupe, the puppet troupe is consisted of about 6 to 7 people, and almost all of them are men, were men at that time, and are still men nowadays. And these men function as musicians who play the traditional oboe and the string instruments and the gong and the drum set and the traditional drums. Next one, please. So they travel together, the puppeteer and the 6 or 7 musicians with all the musical instruments and the puppets, and in a small pickup van. And in those days, they would go from one site, one communities to another, and perform in temples, in houses, or in communal spaces where they are hired to perform. Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Now, this lady that you see in the image, I call her Sister Tum, and her name is Pratum or Nang Pratum. And she is among very few women puppeteer in those days. And now she, in the picture, you can see her holding a character known as Rup Nabot, who represent the puppeteer himself or herself. And this character appeared at the beginning of all the performances when he will sing or chant some kind of incantation in order to salute the teachers, the parents, the host, the audience, and everyone involved. Next one, please. Next slide, please. And the puppets. Now each troupe will have about 150 to 200 puppets, which are made of cowhide. They are carved into different characters, and they are kept in bamboo folders like the one you see in the picture. Next one, please. This is another character, Shiva, but known in Thai as the ox figure, and he's considered one of the gods or the teachers of the tradition. Next one, please. And you'll see in the next picture that this is a range of characters represented by puppets. On the top row, you will see some prince, a young man, a young woman, hermits, and giant or ogre. And on the bottom row, you'll see a range of clowns. Now, the clowns' figures are always painted in black, no color at all. And they have some kind of body deformities that make them look rather strange. But the clowns are very, very important in performances because humor is the kind of the crucial, is the crucial point or the focus of each performance. Apart from, telling stories about prince and princesses and adventures and giant and battles, there will be scenes where the clowns, who function as assistants of the principal characters, will come out and make jokes in the local language, in the local dialect. And their jokes are often about social commentaries, political situations, satires, mocking officials, government officials like the police or the district officers, particularly about corruption in the government. So people really enjoy these commentaries, and it is the major attraction of a performance. Next, please. Now, I'd like to talk about another tradition. This is the dance drama in central Thailand, and this is the tradition that I studied in the 90s. So that's about 25 years ago. It's the folk dance drama that is performed as a kind of offering to spirits. Next one, please. Now, what happened is, there's this common practice, belief and practice in Thailand as well as Southeast Asia, that you can ask spirits or some sacred site for a favor. It can be to get well, to have some kind of fortune, or to be rich. And once your wish is, and you have to make a promise that once your wish is granted, you will give some gift to the spirit. You can give some flowers, you can give some food. And if it's really important, a big thing at stake, you will give a performance of a dance or a dance drama. Next, please. So this dance drama functions as a kind of vow releasing offering that you make to spirits together with food and other offerings. Next, please. There are many groups like this in central Thailand, but I focus on one group in Ayutthaya, which is about 70 kilometers north of Bangkok. This is a family group run by a lady by the name of Patiu. I call her Auntie Tiu. And Auntie has a lot of brothers and sisters, and they were all performers, artists, and musicians. But Diu, the leader, the owner of the troupe, she inherited the skill, the artistic skill, from both her father and her mother, who belong to lineages of performers who can trace back 4 or 5 generations in history. So it's an old tradition that has been passed on from one generation to the next. And in addition to people in the family, she also adopted all kind of rather like taking care of children in the community who are in difficult circumstances. They can stay at her house, and she will teach them to sing and to dance so that they have some kind of skill to make a living and earn some income. Next one, please. So in a troupe like this, you'll see, people who are very old and people who are very young. And Auntie Tiu told me that she will not leave anyone behind. She wants to help everyone. So it's kind of social welfare for the community, as well as an artistic tradition and a way of living. Next one, please. And next one, please. Yes, so this is the picture of Auntie Tiu, and she is putting on the headdress for one of the characters. She can sing and she dances, and as well as manages the troupe. There are quite a lot of people in this troupe, much bigger than the shadow play. Next one, please. And so that is a kind of overview of the 2 performing tradition that I studied. Now, I'd like to make some remarks and reflections about the life of these women artists that I came across during my study. Next slide, please. First, I'd like to talk about Sister Tum, the puppeteer. It would be good if I can have the next slide. Oh, that's okay. Now, to become a puppeteer 50 years ago, was not easy. Sister Tum came from a farming family, and her family were not very happy about her becoming a puppeteer, but she liked it so much from an early age. So by the time she was about 10 or 11, she started making up these puppets using sometimes leaves, sometimes paper, and then practicing articulating them and singing and making up rhymes and making up stories. But in fact, her family were very much against it, and she was punished for doing this because they think it's a kind of their attitude at that time that being a puppeteer is not a profession or an occupation that a woman should be involved in, because shadow play is a world of men. All the musicians were men, and very, very few women puppeteers existed at the time. Then there are not many nowadays either. And in order to make a living as a puppeteer, you had to travel with a group of men for many days sometimes, in order to go to one place to another to perform. And these men, sometimes they drink, sometimes they kind of make jokes. So it's not really proper for a woman to be part of this kind of culture. But anyway, Sister Tum was adamant. She had strong determination that she wanted to be a puppeteer, so much so that the family had to allow her to go to study the art of shadow play with a senior puppeteer in the same village. And she started performing. She went through the ritual of becoming a proper puppeteer, and kind of became quite famous, really. Oh, thank you. Became quite famous. In 1976, when I started working with her, she was well recognized as a woman puppeteer. And after that, she was invited to teach the art of shadow play in some education institutions, education colleges, and so on. She had to overcome all these family obstacles and becoming a skillful and a well-recognized famous puppeteer, and she can manage her musicians, and she's kind of she has to be a trustworthy person so as not to disappoint the host, and so she kind of overcame all these obstacles and became a well-recognized puppeteer. But it's interesting that even with her own talent and her own artistic and managerial skills, people know her as Nang Prathum Sien Chai in Thai. This is like her stage name, which can be translated as Puppeteer Prathum, who has a male voice. So she is known as a woman who can speak like a man, because when you perform this shadow play, you have to vocalize each character. So you have to speak as a man and a woman and a clown and a hermit, an old man, young man, so on. And Sister Thum has a very good voice, which is kind of rather husky voice, and she can make it sound like a man speaking. But it's quite interesting for me that for a woman, to become well recognized in the world of shadow puppet, she has to emulate the masculine quality in order to be recognized. So I mean, the puppet world is still very much the world which is led by the value of the man, of masculinity. Now, turning from the story of Sister Thum to Auntie Tieu, it's slightly different in the sense that she came from an artist family, so there was no difficulty or no challenges for her to become an artist. And her family supported her. But what is difficult for her is that this kind of artistic tradition, the dance drama, is kind of falling into decline over the years. I noticed that in the past, 25 years that I have known her, the troupe has become smaller and smaller. This is because the older generation, some of the sisters, her elder sisters, as well as older brothers, passed away. And in fact, Auntie Tieu is getting on. She's approaching 80s now. And the young generation who were trained, they kind of, once they have reached a certain age, they had their own family, and they would like to do other things like, selling things, becoming vendors, or work in factories rather than performing. And on top of that, this kind of dance drama has been superseded by other forms of performing art like ligue, or other kind of modern entertainments. So it's become associated with rather being old-fashioned, to perform this dance and drama. So in fact, nowadays there are very, very few opportunities to perform, especially during the COVID restriction. There was no work at all, no engagement at all. And he said that, oh, it's a difficult time. Nobody could afford to hire a troupe to perform a kind of an all-day performance. I mean, if you're going to perform a whole drama, you need a whole day to perform. So what people do is just maybe hire them to perform some small dances instead of doing the whole thing. So she said herself that she thinks the tradition will end with her. That there's very little chance for it to continue, right? So, and lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about my own position as a woman anthropologist, what kind of challenges or what kind of opportunities I had in studying these traditions. Well, 50 years ago, being a woman in a community, I was a stranger, nobody knew me. It was quite hard for me to work with the shadow puppet troupe that are led by a male puppeteer. My own family, the family I stay with in the community were all worried. So in the end, I decided that the kind of solution would be to study a woman puppeteer, even if a woman puppeteer is quite an unusual phenomenon in those days. But it's kind of like serendipity, I mean, it's a challenge. And I realized that I wouldn't be able to present a kind of a culture from everybody's point of view, but that is to be expected. Your knowledge of culture, your knowledge of tradition is only a kind of a partial truth. You will not be able to be omnipresent and knows everything. But it has given me an opportunity to meet this wonderful person, both Sister Tum and Auntie Tiw. But by the time I studied Auntie Tiw, I didn't have problems, being a young woman, a graduate student, a stranger in the community, because I was kind of already a university professor, and I could work with them without much difficulties. The only difficulties that I had was to speak to the children, the younger generation in the troupe. They wouldn't like to talk to me because they think I'm an old woman or a friend of the leader of the group. So they're kind of feeling awkward talking to me. But anyway, I just like to end by saying that the life of these artists, are wonderful. If you think that I'm somebody who works in cultural heritage, I may write about it, I may talk about it, I may teach about it. But in fact, it was these women, Sister Tum and Auntie Tiw, who are the true culture bearers. They are the ones who carry on the tradition. They don't write about it, but all the knowledge, all the practice are embodied within them. And that's why they could carry on the tradition. But it is not easy for women. I'm a professional woman, and I know it's hard. I always have this divided loyalty. I have children and I have work, and it's always, I can never be a good mother. I can never be a good career woman. But these women, they have to manage. They raise their children in the theater with them, all the time, and they could manage that. And it's kind of a humbling experience for me, learning from them. But life is dangerous. It is difficult. And this is what happened to Sister Tum. In 1992, she was performing in I'm not sure whether it was a temple or some kind of fair. And there were kind of audience, in front of the theater. And there were men drinking. And they became rowdy, and there was a commotion, and they made a lot of noise. And she was slightly annoyed by that, and she made some commentaries in her performing, about drinking habit. And the guy, the drunkard guy, he just took out a gun and shot into the screen. The bullet killed her instantly. So, this is just to show the vulnerability of a woman, or in fact, man as well, working as a puppeteer. Life is full of danger when you perform in open air among strangers, among the audience you don't know. But anyway, that's a kind of the tragic event, really, that ends the story. But I would like to take this opportunity to honor these women. I mean, they are the true heroes or heroines of cultural heritage, not me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajahn. Thank you so much for sharing with us with this very interesting two traditional artists who are also the female heroes to safeguarding this intangible cultural heritage to keep going on. Thank you very much, Ajahn. To all attendees, if you have questions or comments, please leave the comments on Facebook or leave them at Q&A box in Zoom. We'll be addressing them after all the presentations. Thank you. So the next presentation will be given by Dr. Charlotte Galloway. She will share her experiences and thoughts on women's work in the cultural sphere, why the better gender equity is needed. Before her presentation, please let me introduce Charlotte to you first. Dr. Charlotte Galloway has spent over 25 years teaching, researching, and working in the cultural heritage field with a special focus on Myanmar, from field research and collection documentation to being appointed a UNESCO expert for Pagan's successful World Heritage listing. Dr. Galloway is an honorary associate professor at the Australian National University and was recently awarded a Medal of Order of Australia for her contribution to education and history. So congratulations, Charlotte, for your successful achievements in your career. And now we are now eager to hear your thoughts and experiences. The floor is yours, Charlotte, please.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Ohnmar. And many thanks for organising this event. And I'm delighted to be sharing it today with Paritta and Heidi as well. And also to see you again too, after our being able to have worked together in Myanmar. All right, share screen. And slideshow. Okay. Oops, let me just get that up. Okay, slideshow from beginning. All right, I hope everyone can see that. Is that correct?
Yes, we can see that.
Good, thank you. Thank you. Look, when I was asked to share my thoughts as a woman working in the heritage field in Southeast Asia, it actually has been rather timely. I retired from my full-time work at the Australian National University, excuse me, at the end of 2020 during the pandemic, and I have an honorary appointment there. But finally, I have some time to go through all my photographs and research notes that I've taken over the last 25 or so years and plan out some future writing. And in the process of doing that, I've been very, it's been great going back through all of these many photographs and so on that I've taken and look back at decades of working in the field, mostly in working with archaeology in Myanmar. And looking at these events in the context of the talk today. And it certainly did become, it's always been evident to me that there's been a gender imbalance, I should say, within the heritage sphere across much of Southeast Asia. But certainly I've noticed that in my own experience in Myanmar, not through any personal necessarily feeling necessarily out of place, or I've always been, treated very well and warmly welcomed. But the positioning of women and men within the very broad field of cultural heritage certainly shows some particular trends. But I'd like to sort of start by saying, really, when embarked on a career in working on heritage, I want to say really how lucky am I? And I think for many women, there's a lot of opportunities working in heritage and areas where we can find avenues for very valuable contributions, which could also be extremely rewarding. And just a brief overview of the sorts of things, I've been lucky enough to do. I went back on my degree is in art history. I did my PhD research on the Buddhist art of early Bagan. I've worked as a curator and registrar in major galleries. I've been involved with Oz Heritage for a number of years and have had the opportunity to participate in capacity building workshops across much of Asia. I've been a lecturer in Asian art history and curatorial studies. And in my work in Myanmar, I've been engaged in capacity developing, capacity building work in museum sector, guest lecturing, and also part of visiting faculty at the University of Yangon Archaeology Department. And it all sort of built up over my career, and I suppose in a way culminated in being appointed one of the UNESCO experts for working on Bagan's World Heritage Nomination dossier. And that in turn has led to work with a number of international organisations doing specific art historical research as part of heritage conservation preservation. And also providing, and I've been lucky enough to work with Ohnmar and other colleagues and helping to develop strategies for improving education and support for Myanmar's heritage preservation and a number of other things along the way. But I suppose with this talk, I'm really focusing perhaps on the last decade because I think once we see the value of, World Heritage sites across Southeast Asia, and this also happens globally, it does give rise to a lot of other opportunities and that really perhaps weren't considered so important before in many parts across the region. So here's just a photo, and it was wonderful that we had Dulsanda Kin as the Deputy Minister of Culture in Myanmar at the time that the Pew Ancient Cities became Myanmar's first World Heritage listing in 2014. And that really opened up, I suppose, the opportunity to, for me, and it was all timely, I was asked, I had a project idea suggested to me for my study leave, and I spent quite a bit of time at the Pew, Sri Kshetra, one of the Pew Ancient Cities, doing capacity building in the museum sector. Working with the archaeology department and the local museum to document all of the catalogue material at the museum, which hadn't been done, and it was part of the, I suppose, the management plan for the site. And then, of course, moving forward, that led eventually to us working on the Bagan's World Heritage listing. And it was an interesting event. I mean, we had a fabulous team. And again, I think this is wonderful if we're able to work in these areas, to work with such a range of colleagues internationally. And it provides, I think, for women too, working, as Paritta was saying, there's often times when it's difficult to work with men and women together just because of cultural reasons. But in these types of platforms, there's quite a degree of mutual respect and understanding and acceptance of working in this type of field. But, I look at this photo at the official photograph of the event, and there's an awful lot of men in black sitting here in the official photograph of the government officials, members of parliament, and so on. So the, yes, gender balance is a little not so even. Just to talk a little bit about, again, opportunities in research and teaching. Said for me, it's there's been this work I was doing in documentation and museum type of development. I've worked with some fantastic people, and the photographs I'm showing, it's not about me, it's about the people that I'm working with, and they've been a terrific bunch. The team, we've been doing a lot of work, and as I said, it was very hands-on type of activity. I went back numerous times for these projects of documentation, working often with some different people. Some of the key people remained. And I was absolutely delighted to see over this time the sort of confidence that gained by those working in this field, and really supporting their engagement, I suppose, and opportunities to feel confident working on a broader, more international sphere. I also did some teaching at the field school about museum activities. And this is sort of also interesting because even though I'm an art historian, working in ancient material in Southeast Asia is it's a bit of an odd position. The art history is not often seen as a separate discipline when you're dealing with historic material. And certainly in Myanmar, I work with the archaeology department, but I'm not an archaeologist. And I'll talk a little bit about, what that means when it comes to working in the field. But it was very easy to sort of put me into this neat and tidy museology type field, of course, which I had expertise in. And it seemed that everyone was a little more comfortable with that. And, I was very happy to share in any way I could. Once it was terrific working with younger people. And this is a group of students from the field school. And as you can see, there's a number of women here. And this is the archaeology field school. It's where they actually do their field archaeology excavation techniques, as well as learn about conservation and so on. They don't actually do excavations, field excavations at university. If anyone wants to go, they do their undergraduate degree in archaeology. And if they want to go on to the field school to become sort of archaeologists in practice, then they need to undergo training here. And this was after actually a condition reporting workshop we did at the museum. So the other work we did, researching is great. And I think within the heritage area, there's so much across the Southeast Asia where, this idea of being able to document and record, there's so much work that still needs doing. And I think there are many avenues open for people to work in this field. Whether there's as many opportunities for women working in archaeology and field work is another matter. But certainly within the museum sector and research and teaching area, there are plenty of really interesting and innovative things that we can do. Just some more photographs. I think too, just as I mentioned, this growing in confidence and also the higher profile given to the museum sector. And I'm sure Heidi will be talking a little bit about this as well, has also given rise to a greater voice for women. Within sort of the whole heritage archaeological field, there really aren't so many female field archaeologists working in Myanmar. So everyone I've worked with has been fantastic. But, clearly there are some cultural barriers to women working in the field, as Paritta mentioned. Young women working with a group of men is an issue. The, very real sort of issue of being in the field and issues just around also, dealing with menstruation and these types of things just make it a bit of a challenge. And often being in very isolated areas can be very difficult as well. When I was doing my work at the university, again, there's actually more female lecturers and tutors at the university in the archaeology department. But again, it's a sort of neat, controlled environment. And, it's very encouraging, though, to see such enthusiasm for working in this field, because it's certainly in the Myanmar context is the starting point for broadening out into further areas of heritage management. Here we were working with setting up the department museum, and so it could be used as a teaching resource. Lecturing and teaching, in heritage field is also really a great opportunity, I think. I was always have to keep on my toes because this was a totally impromptu, oh, yes, we'll come and take you out to the first year, see the first year students, which were on another campus. And before I knew it, I was giving a lecture that was totally unscripted and unprepared about what it's like to work in heritage and some of my own experiences. It's within Myanmar too, there has been a great rise since the World Heritage listing of the Pure Ancient Cities, an increase in awareness of, regional museums, supporting local cultural heritage, and some great initiatives have started out. We were able to run a workshop in Naypyidaw with Oz Heritage, which brought in young people from across Myanmar to provide them with basic training on, how to care for collections and so on. So there is this sort of awareness of importance. It's put it more on the government profile too for providing support for, regional heritage development. And I suppose, of course, Bagan being such an important site in Myanmar, and of course recognised as an important global heritage site. This also, I had the opportunity, I was asked to continue the work I'd done at PA, and as the dossier was being prepared, I helped train the staff at Bagan in documenting the collection for the nomination dossier. And this has again provided sort of ongoing training within Myanmar for care of heritage collections. And as you can see, every single person here is a woman. And I'll make some general comments there about, as I said, the positions that women hold within the museum sector and how that plays out perhaps across the whole heritage sector. Interesting too is, something I'm very can see a lot of potential and opportunities in heritage across Southeast Asia is in the whole idea of visitor experience. And it's an interesting idea that often people don't think about this very much. But I think it's a growing field, and where, as museums, the role of museums becomes more sort of accepted within various communities as a way of preserving heritage. And this is sometimes a relatively new concept in some parts of Southeast Asia, that this is an opportunity for providing, this connection, understanding between visitors, outsiders, local people in understanding the importance of heritage. And how we explain that to people is really important. And I think this is a great opportunity. And I think it is a great opportunity for women, because I'm allowed to say that. I'll say this in this avenue. I think, as Paritta said, we balance everything from family to work, et cetera, often feeling we never do a great job with either, or not our best at either, as our time is taken in so many different directions. But we often do. So much of regional and local heritage is often family-based, lineage-based. Women are often in a very good position to understand the multifactorial aspects of this. And communicating that to outsiders is often perhaps a really good, can be done particularly with great care and thought. Just make sure that we're just going. Just again, a slightly different, challenge. As I said, there are challenges too to working in this area. And something like going to Halin, the archaeological museum there, it's in a very remote location. Conditions for just even working there are challenging. Many of the archaeological sites across the whole region, and I talk about Southeast Asia, are in really remote locations. Difficult living, just daily conditions. which can provide some more sort of difficulties for women. And I do feel the things we can't see in some of these slides, the actual working conditions with temperature and so on, which is also just amazed at how robust people can be working across the region compared to my more four seasons type of climate. But again, it's, the opportunities of, training, preserving heritage. And it's really has, I feel, in the last decade, there's been a real lift in the level of understanding of the need to conserve and preserve, and also the best ways of doing it. And for me, it's certainly about, documentation is the first step, because we can't look after what we don't know we have. And we have to make that documentation available to the public. I think the staff movement, there's pluses and minuses of that within the structure in Myanmar, which is always under discussion. There's regular transfers of people from one location to another. While that's great for spreading some expertise, it also sort of disables the ability to build on local expertise and really build up a very strong, fixed sort of management systems, particularly within the museum sector. But that said, I mean, there's been many organisations and people who've gone in and helped develop this museum sector. And we know that level of expertise has improved dramatically in the last decade. And with the research, it's part of the opportunity, and I'd like to see this happen more within the people actually working within the museums and in the archaeology areas, publishing their outcomes. And key, certainly for me, when we were doing the documentation of the Sri Kshetra Museum collection, we were very fortunate enough to get some funding, and this has been made available. The inventory has been made available. And as documentation, it's, not exactly perfect, but it does enable more research to be undertaken. And I believe this is, part of my work's also extended into issues of, art trading and theft and provenance issues. And one way of certainly ensuring that there's better track on items is to make them available publicly through documentation. So while it's all, I'm talking more the positives, there are some challenges and realities of working, in field work. This being just sort of one of them, a little light-hearted one, and you never know what you're going to find when you're digging through storerooms. But, as I said, things like the conditions we're working in, stinking hot, humid, there's, often just, as I said, physically can be quite demanding conditions. And, working in the field, it's, as I said, this is at Sri Kshetra, so there is the field school here. So women are involved on working on the site, but it's nearly all men that are in charge of the field excavations. And I was actually trying to think of any senior field archaeologists in Myanmar, and I couldn't actually think of someone. And it's sort of ironic because some of the most prominent international archaeologists who've been working in Myanmar for decades are women. And I think, sure you all know of Elizabeth Moore and sadly the Janice Stargart, who died a year or so ago. And we also have an Italian archaeologist who's been working here for many years as well. Isolation, traveling, doing research, it's fun, but, I've been traveling, we travel on our own, often cars driven by men. It's just what needs to happen. And that's, does come with some risk and uncertainty. Working, this is not always fun and games. There's the formality of meetings, if you're, which can take up an awful lot of time. And there are protocols that go with this that often too, I feel, can be a little male dominated in this area. And it's mostly the women that we see here are actually internationally based. So one thing we try and do as I sort of come to wrap this up, try and spread the word about the opportunities and, you know, really engaging things that can be done working in heritage, and not just for local women, but also for women outside. I mean, I've taken my students to Myanmar. We talk about all the opportunities. I think sharing cultural heritage across the whole region is a great way of, you know, of helping support it. Because people become aware of the significance of much of the cultural heritage that might be not their own. You know, we take people to Bagan, we have nice talks, we find out why things are important. You know, the education process, I think, is really, really significant. And this is an avenue where I feel, you know, again, you know, we're talking about opportunities. And just a group of students, and interestingly, in my university, that we have out of all the people doing art history, I'd say 90% of them are women. People doing cultural heritage and museum studies, the number's very much the same. Archaeology is much more evenly balanced. So, you know, that's sort of saying something. It's not just it's, I think, pretty much a common situation in many places. And as I finish on these sort of two slides, when I was going through them, I was just thinking, you know, it's been such a sort of pleasure for me and a wonderful experience working with my colleagues in Myanmar. And however, you know, there's so much genuine optimism and enthusiasm. But I just feel, you know, we really do, you know, nearly all of my experiences working in the heritage field have been positive. There's a genuine interest in capacity building. But for me, probably the biggest issue is one of convincing often the broader public that museums and heritage are important. It's interesting, it's a Western sort of concept, and working in Southeast Asia, there's often areas where they think it's something that needs to be done, but attitudes towards cultural heritage are a bit different. But it is important, not because, you know, us as outsiders might say so, but because heritage plays such a critical role in our identities. And this is only often recognised when it comes under threat, and then it's often too late. And heritage and research and engagement is gender equal, and we need equal representation across all heritage fields to ensure that we create this balanced view of the past. And that's so important for those of the future. So just on that note, I'll finish here and I'll hand it back to Ohnmar. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, for sharing with us with very interesting experience working in Myanmar. Thank you so much. And dear attendees, if you have any questions to Charlotte, please put your questions in the comments if you are on Facebook, and put it in the Q&A box if you're in the Zoom. We'll have a Q&A session after the 3 presentations. Thank you. So now, may I invite Dr. Heidi Dunn for her presentation. Her topic is In Search of the Inclusive Museum. Before the presentation, please let me introduce Heidi to you all. Dr. Heidi Dunn worked at Asian Civilization Museum Singapore, ACM, for 2 decades. From the assistant curator to the principal curator, then she became the deputy director of the curatorial department. She is now lecturer in curating and museology at School of Arts at SOAS University. So may I kindly invite Dr. Heidi Dunn to share your experiences as a curator and the search for making museums more inclusive.
Thank you, Ohnmar. Thank you so much for that kind of introduction. And good morning from the United Kingdom to all of you. As you can see, I'm still drinking my cup of tea. I invited you for tea and friendly discussion today, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A and discussion with all of you. Thank you to Paritta and Charlotte. You raised many really crucial questions about being women and working in these fields. and really you mentioned some very, very honest truths about the challenges that we face. Now, what I'm going to do is share my screen. And once I've done that, maybe just also to say that what I'm planning to do here is to give you a little bit of a break by watching a short video. And I've chosen this video, If Museum Walls Could Speak. It's about 5 minutes long. And it's made by two academics who work at the University of London. And it's raising some important questions about what it means to be a woman and working in the museums in the UK, especially the large government, large national museums. And although these issues may be very sort of unique to the UK, I'm hoping that it raises some questions in your own mind about the kinds of challenges and opportunities that you face in Southeast Asia. And then I'll look at some kind of scientific data about differences between men and women, particularly the gender gap, as they call it, as it exists today around the world and also in Southeast Asia. And I'll have a think about whether, how relevant some of this information is to my own experience of working in the museum. So you may recognize some of these images. You may find some of the language here a bit strange and unusual, but these issues that the women are raising are some of the issues already actually raised by Charlotte, especially just now. So let's hope this works.
It's almost like if we were to paint a picture of a leader in very traditional terms, what would they look like? Big, tall, probably quite good looking, and sound posh. Oh, cliche.
I sort of ticked all the boxes for them, and they appointed me because I am the change. But can they deal with it? They want my leadership style to fit in with their ideas of what a leader can be, and I don't work in that way.
Trustees are going to be recruiting blokes in suits because they are blokes in suits.
The collections I look after are primarily looted from my ancestors, right? I mean, that's how these collections came into being. So there really is something in the very foundation of the institution that makes it inimical to, I would say, the intellectual authority of people of colour.
At work, I speak a little bit more posh than I would normally speak. I don't like that. I know it's necessary because they treat you differently. They might not realise it, but they do.
I am so used to silencing. It's only afterwards I go, hang on a minute, what does that person know and what do I know? Me asserting my expertise, that's been a hard thing for me. It weighs heavy on me, real heavy on me.
People would say to me, wow,
You're very young to be a director, but you're very small to be a director. I mean, size really got commented on a lot. Those tiny shoulders, that sort of thing came to me all the time. There were networks to do with sport, to do with pubs that people drank in that facilitated activity. And if you were female, I'm afraid you really weren't in those networks. You were doubly hindered by the fact that any woman who tried to assert themselves too actively would be viewed with a bit of suspicion. They don't mind if you're a person of colour doing cataloguing or contributing some kind of linguistic expertise, technical aspects. But if you're a lead curator or a head of a division, that's something the institution has a lot of trouble coping with. And it will basically just bully you until you leave.
I lost my femininity and my identity, actually, in many ways, because I have measured myself against men's values in the workplace. And at the end of the day, there was no way I was ever going to succeed, was I? We've had to get into that scrum, and it hurt us.
I remember having to go to the toilet and have a little cry because I'd seen these instruments of torture, that have been labeled in such innocuous ways, and just thinking about my family history in relation to Jamaica.
We're seeing evidence of silencing, of censorship, of work being pulled. That is real. I can see that attraction in organisations. We are operating in a climate of fear and appeasement of a right-wing agenda.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in this film, and we don't have time to do that. But if you're interested to watch it again, there's a link there, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end of this this session. Just to really summarize what we saw there, I think what these 40 women who were interviewed were getting at was the fact that their own position in the organization was constantly a challenge for them, because what they were measuring up against was the senior management, who were men, blokes in suits, as they called it, and Charlotte already referred to men in black suits earlier on, and the kind of networks that those men engage in are not welcoming to women, and all the many challenges of being from ethnic minority groups, class, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. What their voices are telling us is that there's a long overdue need to recognize the diverse nature of the workforce in the UK, but also in other museums around the world. Think about your own institution that you work for now, or may have worked for before. How diverse was it in these kinds of ways, gender, ethnicity, and so on? And there's potential, I feel, for radical change by leveraging on diversity in ways that could transform not only our museum's organizational culture, but also the way the museum conducts its own processes of museum work in the production of cultural knowledge. Okay, so now I'm trying to get to the next slide and I can't. Okay, What do these questions raise for me, thinking back to my experience as a curator working in Singapore from about mid-1990s until around 2014? Well, to a great extent, these observations in the UK do not really play out exactly in my experience. I entered the museum during an early growth phase of the museum in the mid to late 90s. Our curatorial team was mainly women, highly educated, and officially Chinese. Note that I'm speaking only about my curatorial team, which was part of a larger museum organization, which was a much more ethnically diverse organization. And the museum itself was kind of like a microcosm of the wider multicultural Singapore. And curators' work at that time would seem to be very much women's work, while museum directorship was male. And cultural affiliations other than gender, my cultural affiliations, elicited a certain level of interest, which at the time I thought was more just kind of bureaucratic curiosity. As for myself, I'm dual Chinese and English heritage. So, but as a Singaporean, I'm officially classified by my father's ethnicity, which is Chinese. So in one way, this identity is somewhat convenient. I'm kind of like, like they said in that video just now, the somatic norm, my identity sort of complied with what the majority were in my team. But at my job interview, I was repeatedly asked to examine my passport, for example. I was asked quite repeatedly, are you Singaporean? And later on, someone suggested to me, it's not so much a question of are you Singaporean, but just how Singaporean are you? Okay, so what the film didn't say was that women are still the majority in the museum workforce in the UK, but they are not very well represented at senior management level. In 2018, a report from the Museum Association in the UK said that 82% of its own staff were female, and that there is still this gender pay gap. There's a difference between how much women and men are paid that they say is 34%. The national average in 2018 in the UK was 9.1%. I don't know what the pay gap was at the time when I was a curator, but definitely we see that the hierarchy in our museum was a very gendered one. That is to say, mostly women up to sort of senior management level, but then directorship was male. And that's not to say that there weren't any female directors in Singapore, there were, but at my museum, this never really materialized. And so this, some more numbers here, just numbers that I found online at the World Economic Forum's report on the gender gap. And you can still see that there's a gender divide across museums and heritage. And this is not a picture unique to Singapore. These trends are familiar across the region. And Charlotte has also addressed this just now. So here's the data on global gender gap, showing a difference between opportunities for men and women at 68.1%, if that means anything to you. And they're saying they estimate it takes another 132 years on average for this gap to close. Don't ask me how you can calculate these kinds of things, but it's kind of interesting to put numbers there. And in terms of gap between education and economic participation, the opportunities differ even more widely. So opportunities for women to receive an education is 94.4% across the world, and economic participation or employment 60.3%. If we look at the table on the right here, it's interesting to see for education and skills attainment in Singapore, the arts and humanities is still high on the list just after education. I don't know how this data, which was collected since I think the early to mid 90s, would have looked in the late 1990s when my team of 9 female curators opened the first wing of the Asian Civilizations Museum. However, in the following years, when museum work proved to be a more viable career option. The demographic of the team became more diverse, so there were more men entering the team. The museum's curatorial narratives were also changing, as the first wing was dedicated to collecting and displaying Chinese art and material culture, whereas the second wing expanded on the museum's mission to address a wider cultural remit. Okay, so let's get to the photographs of the museum, which some of you may be familiar with. ACM's mission from the start emphasized the importance of connecting with Singapore's ancestral cultures. And this emphasis on cultural diversity was established from the opening of the first wing in 1997, and then later the second wing in 2003. And the issue of diversity was a direct response to Singapore's multicultural population. It was an invitation to the public to come and imagine where they felt most comfortable, what their sense of place would be within not only Singapore, but the region, the wider region and beyond. By 2008, when the museum opened its sister institution, the Peranakan Museum, this invitation to look across cultures was more nuanced, with an emphasis on how blended cultures, hybrid cultures like Peranakan, came about. The question of how rather than what became more and more important. And the most satisfying moment was when visitors started to question just how Chinese or how Malay or how Indian or how other am I? The old model known as SEAMEO, C-I-M-O, Chinese, Indian, Malay, and other, which is, underpins Singapore's public policy making, was making way towards a recognition of hybridity that resonated well with our audiences. So people were keen to cross cultures and look at themselves in more cross-cultural kind of ways. However, in 2003, at the second wing of the ACM, galleries were laid out very much according to regions. The curators usually had regional specific training, and they researched and developed the collections in this way. Consultation was taken with academic and local audiences in relation to thematic displays, which were going to be very object heavy. As you can see, there are many objects in our showcases there. The inclusion of local voices was a concern from the start, and this was addressed through digital documentation done by curators with communities who practiced so-called living traditions. And their presence could be quite pronounced, as in this case, the next slide. The case of the performing arts in Southeast Asia. And here we had personal interviews from performers in the region. You can see projected life-size projection in the background there. And we also involved local performers in Singapore who played the gamelan that you see there, the orchestral set, and showed others how to play, how to engage with this musical tradition from Java. And we remained attentive to this idea of how to include other voices throughout the 2000s, especially when it came to having these special exhibitions of loan collections from Southeast Asian museums. We conducted more in-depth engagements with source communities, and we involved regional curators in research and co-production of these exhibitions, and this one in particular. Where in this case, we tried to give greater recognition to the multiplicity of religious practices that underscore the rubric of Buddhist art. So recognizing that Buddhist art can be seen in many different ways, hence the title Enlightened Ways. A way was being opened up for multiple conversations around the nature of rituals and how our museum could engage in more than one way with ritual. On one hand, you have objects which were elevated to this status called art through what we call the museum effect that ACM had worked out so finely over the years and refined so well. Yet within this was a subtle use of protocol for rituals that had been worked out with museum conservators. So I go to the next slide here, and you'll note that protocol for ritual in the museum means that, for example, we had to design these plinths that these Buddha images stood on with more depth, more wider kind of design. so that they could receive offerings that our visiting Buddhist visitors wanted to give. So the protocol included flowers, but without water, candles that were not lit, and fruit, which was not cut up. As expected, these were received from visiting Buddhists who recognized the exhibition as an opportunity to make merit. The exhibition notably engaged new research into more ephemeral ritual objects and their continued use, such as this 31-meter painted scroll from Northeast Thailand. And scholars Lidam Lefferts and the late Wayupa Tosa led a field trip for curators and educators to engage with the scroll's original community of owners in Northeast Thailand. And this resulted in a publication on the painting and a digital version of the elaborate story, which you can find here in this little tiny computer kiosk in the display. And it's a very elaborate story. It's the Vasantara Jataka. And this kiosk provided a kind of interactive for visitors to scroll along the whole 31 meters and find out more about this story. And after that, this exhibition provided a way for this scroll to be kept on display in the museum in the permanent gallery, and every few years it would be rolled in another direction and a different scene would be able could be accessed by the public, put on display. In the 2 years leading up to that exhibition, the museum educators and myself participated in the Sirindon Anthropology Centre's Intangible Heritage Field Schools in Northern Thailand, at that time managed and run by our friend Paritta. And one of the outcomes was a residency for villagers whose Salak Yom, or Trees of Offering, festival became an extension of the sections of the exhibition section on popular Buddhism and merit making. Educators were keen to give audience hands-on experience and to learn directly from villagers about the handcrafted offerings and how to make them. The festival and its historical origins as a rite of passage for young women in the Yong community around Lampun in northern Thailand was discussed by anthropologist Alex Dennis, whose work was published in the exhibition catalogue. So many people were involved in the construction of this exhibition. The project was the culmination of my career at the ACM, I think, not least because it led me to doctoral research, having realized the existence of local monastery museums through the SAC Field School, and in particular the work of Ajahn Paritta, who's with us today. I have her to thank for this encouragement, although she may not have known it at the time. This was encouragement to take off my institutional curator's hat, refocus my frame of reference, and go back into the field. And in 2013, I already started work on an exhibition of Buddhist art in Myanmar, and I found a way into places called pagoda museums. And I found a new means to sustain my curatorial research practice in academia. What I found is that pagoda museums have much to offer the state-funded museums. Both may still be subject to gendered forms of working. They're, like all museums, staffed predominantly by women and led by men. But pagoda museums are also sites for abundant and diverse collections. The ritual basis for existence, one can argue, motivates collecting practices that can be called equitable and inclusive. The devotees donate all kinds of things, and donors include Buddhists and non-Buddhists. However, I also found that larger pagoda museums, such as this one at Shwedagon Pagoda, were trying hard to contain the ritual activity, while state-funded museums often accommodated the ritual needs of their own staff. There's a lot of text here, and please do re-watch the video if you'd like to look at this in more detail. So these are some of the diverse and eclectic collections that you find in pagoda museums in Myanmar. Some of you will be very familiar with this. So inclusivity in the museum. Yeah, so I found that state-funded museums in many parts of Southeast Asia actually do include kind of ritual activities in response to the needs of their own staff, who often conduct these things spontaneously or ask management to help them to do so. So this example in National Museum of Cambodia accommodates large and elaborate annual rituals for their staff. In contrast, smaller rituals were observed at state museums in Myanmar. And I have a wonderful photo here of Dor Baby leading prayers for safe passage for the Alodorpi Buddha, who traveled to New York and Singapore in 2015 and 2016. At the Asian Civilizations Museum in 2016, curator Konan Cheong engaged members of the Burmese community and Burmese monks who are based in Singapore to welcome the wish-fulfilling Buddha. And he even sought out donations from the museum's staff in order to do this. And there's a write-up of the Buddha that came from the museum and its parallel life in the pagoda in Bagan, and which it kind of explains why this Buddha is so important to Myanmar people. And I'm probably running ahead of time, but anyway, I'd like to close here. I'd like to say simply in conclusion that I acknowledge the value of what I experienced was really the value of collective work of colleagues, male and female, across the museum's various departments. I'm reminded of this time and again as my students now struggle to understand the nature of curatorial work, essentially as teamwork. The more diverse the team, the greater the chances of addressing different perspectives and bringing in different voices and sustaining the core work of curatorship. What is the core work of curatorship? It's the care and custodianship of knowledge systems, practices, right, intangible cultural heritage, and the related things that we put on display all the time, including the sacred objects. In other words, in a way, we're all curators in one way or another. And the more inclusively we can approach our work, I feel the more that diversity and inclusivity can be reflected in the museum's own outputs, in the way it produces knowledge. For me, this work has been extremely rewarding and satisfying over the years, and I have so many people to thank, not just the people in these photographs. And it has always been a work in progress, and it always will be. And I think, like most things in life, we all struggle to find a way to sustain our curatorial research practice. But if it wasn't for all these other people, I don't think I could have sustained mine. And it's to them that really I owe so much gratitude. And I finished there with these rather candid photographs. Some of the best times for me were in the mount making workshop at the National Museum in Yangon in 2011, where you can see my colleague, Mr. Mazlan Anwar on the left there, who was a master mount maker who has now sadly passed away, is still remembered by many museum colleagues in Myanmar for that mount making workshop that we ran. The female museum workers were the first to step up, wanting to work with grinders, pliers, and brass rods in order to learn how to make mounts for objects, how to make mounts that would be as beautiful as the objects, that would meld into the background and really enable objects to speak to visitors when they're put on display. And the picture on the right shows us rather urbanite, Singapore curators trying to feel relaxed in a rather rural, what we call ulu surrounding. We went on one of these team outings to a very hot and sticky place called Bollywood Veggies, which is one of the only organic farms in Singapore. And the high point, of course, was eating the organic vegetables from the farm. But here you can see kind of a slightly more diverse group by 2005. There's a couple of men there. And oh yes, I should add that, Charlotte raised the issue of women and balancing their multiple priorities. Only one of those women in the picture actually had children during my time at the museum. And today, as we speak, only 2 of the 9 or 10 curators at the ACM have actually just recently given birth to lovely kids. So museum curators come to this late in life, I find. For me, it never happened. And most of them, however, remain very dedicated to their work in the museum. And I'd like to end there and encourage questions and answers and discussion at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi, for highlighting this very fascinating topics. Thank you very much. So now, after all the thought-provoking presentations, it's now time for a Q&A session. So all of the 3 speakers are like museum experts and related to ICH, Intangible Cultural Heritage. And I would like to ask the speakers, do you have any comments and questions to each other? And then you will have 1 comment on a question due to the time limitation, so that if you can ask and give the comments to each other, please.
I don't mind going first on this, because it was actually where Heidi finished up on the women who'd had their children and otherwise. And one thing I did have written down to remark on was, in fact, many of the women I worked with in Myanmar in the Department of Archaeology and at the university remained single. So they were actually, their career, it was a sort of like a career choice. And it was like one or the other. So many of them were actually single women. And the issue of pay, it's part of this cultural thing of working in the university, working in museums is very lowly paid, very low pay, but it's considered a very respectable profession. So it's an interesting diversity. Men go out and earn lots of money and do something exciting. Women who want a career and want to do something that's fulfilling end up in low-paid jobs, but have that respectability. And that's something that I don't know how we can change to, I think, what is it, 80+% of the lecturers at Yangon Uni, I think, are women. It's something crazy that is sort of, divide.
Any comments from Ajahn Paritta or Heidi?
Well, I'm not very well informed on statistics, but I think general there's a trend for people, even if they are married, for not to have children. I mean, this is a kind of general pictures, not only what happened in heritage work or in museums. I don't really know, but it's just my observation. Yeah. But I have questions or maybe point for discussion for, in fact, for both Charlotte and Heidi. And you mentioned local museums in Myanmar, and that is something that I close to my heart, local museums. But I noticed that I don't know about in Myanmar. I would love to hear your, please inform me. In Thailand, a majority of local museums are run by monasteries or temples. So they tend to be, pagoda museums or monastery museum or temple museums, whichever you call them. And because, that the kind of the setting is a Buddhist monastery, they tend to be run by monks. And I mean, this is a point of contention whether women can become monks in Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia. But, because of their situation, the Buddhist monastery context and the support that they have from the monastery, it seems like the people who manage these local museums are men. Obviously, women help, but they tend to play the role of supporters, assistants. But people who make decisions tend to be men. Yeah, I don't know whether it's the same in Myanmar.
Yes, I mentioned that it's a gendered kind of vocation in the sense that it's mandated from the start that trustees and custodians of temples are male. They're older males, men who are respected by the community. And they do this work in their retirement years until they drop dead. They're usually committees of them, although one pagoda museum that I visited in Shan State, there was really just one active trustee who was wondering, because all the trustees kept dying, there wasn't really a very regular system of replacement. And so it was getting more and more difficult to continue his work. But yes, monastery museums, I didn't study so many monastery museums as such, but yeah, monks definitely were. I did see one or two where monks were actively involved in looking after and running something called a museum with displays that people visited and so on. But I also met monks who were very secretive and kept collections, but out of sight. Collections that privately they kept them themselves in their own rooms. You could never get access to easily. But yes, and the workforce were women in the Shui Dugong Pagoda. The staff is very predominantly women who run the museum and who do the day-to-day work. The men, the person who's most actively involved in making decisions is someone who calls himself a volunteer, not exactly a pagoda trustee, a volunteer who's not paid. And it's a form of merit making to do this work, to dedicate your time and your labor in this way. And the people who are handling the more sacred objects, shining and polishing them and keeping them looking shiny and new, were male volunteers. One was a goldsmith, I think, in his his last work before retirement, or a silversmith, I think. So yeah, certain kinds of jobs definitely, yeah, for men and others for women. I don't think that will change really.
Okay, thank you, Heidi. And then there's a question from Facebook from Victoria Rehuso. Question is, for highly patriarchal societies, how do you think women can actively participate and grow in the heritage and cultural work careers without being disrespectful of traditions? So who will respond to this question?
I had a similar question as that actually for Paritta about the female puppeteer. How when these individuals break out of the mold and do something radical that goes against this patriarchal norm, what is it, do you think, that drove her to do that work? How did she manage to negotiate her way past her parents and everyone? How do you think she did it? Was it just sheer willpower, or how?
I can only answer based upon my experience working with Sister Thum. She's a very strong character, and she has the determination to become a puppeteer, even if it was against the will of her family. And another thing that I noticed is that she has the support of her husband. When I was working, she was already married, and her husband was a school teacher. And for some reason, he seems to comply to her wish and let her, kind of lead the decision. Yeah. Other female puppeteers, I didn't know very well. I think one that lived in the same neighborhood. She was unmarried at that time, so I don't know. But if you ask these women, the story that you get tend to be, it is something that is their calling. It's something that once they see it, it's hard to forget, and it is something that draws them into it very much. I noticed that this is the kind of narrative that they use. The puppeteers as well as other women dancers that I came across later. They say that they would say that they started because they went to a performance and they were drawn by the attractions of the performance, the magic of the performance, that they wanted so much to become one. But each one will have to work their way through all kinds of obstacles and difficulties before they could become an artist themselves.
Yeah. Thank you. Charlotte, would you like to add anything else on that?
Yes, and I think part of that question was about that you asked was about what can women do in these heritage fields, and where can they start to address imbalance. And I think it's going to be a slow process because the cultural norms are so entrenched. But it's possible. And I mean, we have to look at a long game, unfortunately. I don't think it's going to be a short-term sort of game. But there are avenues, I think, where, women can start to get known and become more authoritative. And, if museums become a place where most women work, that's the opportunity for research and writing and publications. And all of a sudden you become that expert, and you'll become known. You might not be able to go out and do the field work. You might not be the director of a centre. You might not be sitting at the top level meetings all the time. But there's, it's women supporting each other in these endeavours, having collaborative projects, and having some outputs which, are not going to upset too many people up here. And unfortunately, as Heidi said, it is just a patriarchal sort of environment in a lot of ways. But there's ways it can be done without upsetting and getting too much pushback. I think we've all know that is not productive. Sometimes we still need leaders. We still need, of course, people who are pushing boundaries. But for many of us, I think it's that chipping away. And there are ways to do it, and that gain respect along the way as well, which I think in many of these environments is so important.
Yes. Can I just add to that? Yes, I totally agree with Charlotte. And in fact, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the term patriarchal. Well, I think, a lot of women might feel that, they're kind of constricted by the values and the kind of men-oriented or men-dominated spheres. But from my observation, it doesn't mean that women are subject to the control or the power of men in all situations or in all contexts. I think in Southeast Asia, I don't know about other culture, apart from gender, there are other things like age and your position. If you are a senior woman, if you are a teacher, for example, then you command respect of your male colleagues or your male former students. They would respect you and treat you, kind of different from if you are young, you are unmarried, yeah, or wealth as well. Your economic position also defines who you are. So it's kind of, I think it's more complex, and the situation is kind of like more of a flux rather than a clear cut, male, female, and this is powerful, this is powerless. I think we have to consider what situation, what context we are talking about. Yeah.
I think I would agree with you. It is a term that gets used perhaps a little bit too freely, and perhaps in a Western context it is a bit different. But and you're right. I suppose it's more like the glass ceiling approach. There's just these barriers that inhibit coming to the top. And as you say, it's quite complex, the cultural environments. On one hand, in lots of Southeast Asia, there's an equal dichotomy balance in gender in terms of, in theory, women can be equal in law, in theory, but there's also entrenched things which make it just some things more difficult.
Yeah. But there are some questions left, like 3 questions to address. So the first one is from Nanue Mo. According to your experience, what is the biggest challenge in museum conservation in Myanmar? So who will respond it, Heidi or Charlotte? Both of you are dealing with the museums in Myanmar.
Heidi, would you like to go first?
Sorry, that was a question about conservation.
The biggest challenge in museum conservation in Myanmar. I think that the conservation means the conservation of the objects in the museum, I think. Yeah. Not the museum building itself. Yeah.
I don't know. I find it hard to put my finger on. There's so many challenges. Charlotte, which would be
look, I've actually pondered this one a lot. I mean, of course, we can do stacks of training on conservation, and yet for me, my experience has shown that unless you really understand why you are doing something, it just won't work and won't be sustainable. And there's one thing between training people and saying, you're looking after humidity, how you, control the environment, do you let people touch things, whatever. But unless you have a really good understanding of why you're doing it, it's almost destined to fail. And people will go in, organizations will give, dehumidifiers to museums in Myanmar, but then they only run them when people are there, or air conditioning. And no matter how often you try and say, this is not the best way to do it, it's not good for objects, you're better off having no air conditioning, and managing the environment. It's like there's just this missing understanding of best practice for Myanmar is not going to be the same as best practice everywhere else. And trying, you want to be part of the international standards for managing things, but, that's not necessarily the best for this environment. And I know that's a rambling answer, and it's not really rambling, and it is rambling, and it's probably, as you said, Heidi, you can't put your finger on it. But to me, it's like, why are you trying to do it? If you really understand why, you'll make it happen. I think the why are you preserving heritage in Myanmar? Why are you looking after these things? What's important? These are big questions for me that I've never really got to the bottom of. And I don't believe a lot of the people I work with have got to the bottom of it either.
So I think there's a lot of emphasis now on not cutting and pasting new technologies and new ideas from international, examples into your locally specific, culture. I think now there's a lot more emphasis on talking about knowing why means actually understanding what it is that you yourselves have been doing all this time, the local specificities, local epistemologies, local ways of knowing and understanding, which is why people are now talking about local museums actually are like the pagoda museums, are the places maybe we need to turn back to look for some answers. What is it that local people have been doing all these centuries? A lot of it may be giving up to the hot weather and the humidity and giving up the idea of permanence, going back to Buddhist ideals of impermanence and so on, to accept that old things die, decay, rot, and go back to some kind of, basic state, and then come back again in another form. So I think understanding why, thank you, Charlotte, you hit the nail on the head. It's not a straightforward answer. You have to search within yourselves, your own culture, for ways for appropriate ways to do things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's the answer our attendee wanted.
Yes. I'd like to support both of you, really. And I think this concept like indigenous museology, right, is really it's very, very interesting. And it's one of the things I find working with community museums or local museums is that they tend to be looked down upon by museum professionals as, unprofessional and, treating objects in unacceptable ways. Like, they would put Buddha images, valuable Buddha images behind bars, but that's within their context, that's the best way that they have for keeping these images safe, right? So I think it is very important to understand from their point of view, from the point of view of local curators, how they think and the kind of resources that they have for conserving these artifacts in their museums. So that is the first response that I have towards the question. But the second point I'd like to make and respond to the questions about raising awareness about heritage and museums is one thing I noticed in Thailand is that in fact people use social media in order to raise awareness about the importance of museum and heritage. In museums in particular, there is a network of people, they call themselves, people who enjoy going to museums. So people will post, contributors will post stories about them visiting museums in Thailand or in other places and talk about, their experience, and there will be discussion about museums management. And I noticed that museum management is another growing branch, a growing sector in Thailand, although it kind of, some of them tends to be too business oriented anyway. So I think, although social media have a lot of problems, I think it can be used or employed in order to raise awareness about heritage and about museums as well. Another thing, the third point, which I noticed in Thailand, excuse me, I'm not sure about museums. When you say that you raise awareness or, getting people to appreciate the value and importance of heritage, I think you have to go a little bit further. A lot of people in Thailand will say that, they appreciate that heritage so much, but they appreciate it from the point of view of tourism, from the point of view of, using the heritage in order for income generating. So it's kind of, we have to get the balance between heritage for tourism and heritage for business, and heritage, as a way to preserving something of value for the coming generation. It's kind of different perspectives, but it seems to me that if we're not clear on this point, heritage will be appreciated for economic and business value predominantly.
Thank you, Ajahn Paritta. So Ajahn Paritta has already addressed the AA News questions, I think. So due to the time limitation, so Ajahn Paritta, this is another question you have already addressed, but from Nanwemo about where do you think the stick puppets culture originally started in Southeast Asia and also in Myanmar have stick puppets. So do you can you answer it again in short for the Facebook viewers, because we replied it in the Zoom Q&A, that's why. Could you please,
Yes, well, thank you for the question. I mean, this question of origin is always intriguing, isn't it? But I'm afraid I have to disappoint you that as far as I know, we have very little historical or archaeological evidence to say conclusively, whether it started in Southeast Asia or in India or in China, because we find the traditions of puppetry in so many places, in many countries in Southeast Asia, definitely, especially Indonesia, Java, Cambodia, Myanmar, of course, Thailand, and so on and so forth. The only thing I can say is that the stories, that the puppet play portray or depict are stories from India, Ramayana and Mahabharata. So there is the influence there, but the technique of puppetry itself is excuse me, it's impossible impossible to tell. India also have puppet tradition. So it is possible that it might have come with the story through traders or religion, but it's probably adapted and reinvented or, made to fit local conditions by Southeast Asian people.
Thank you, Ajahn. So may I now pass over to the MC, my colleague John, for the closing the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Ohnmar. And thank you, Dr. Paritta. Thank you, Dr. Charlotte. And thank you, Dr. Heidi, for sharing your careers in cultural heritage, challenges, and opportunities with us today. I am sure our viewers were able to obtain valuable insights from all of your experiences. And also thank you to our viewers and attendees who sent in comments and questions. We really appreciate and value your participation. We have also chosen the winners of our SPAFA souvenirs from your participation, and we will be in contact with all of you lucky winners shortly. We have also put an evaluation link in Facebook and on Zoom. We would really appreciate it if you could spare just a few minutes to fill out the evaluation form, which will help us improve future SPAFA sessions. And last but not the least, if you want to revisit this very interesting talk, we will have a recording of it immediately after on Facebook. And we will also upload a recording on SEAMEOSPAFA's YouTube channel where you can watch all of our previous SPAFA sessions together with other SEAMEOSPAFA videos. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us, and thank you again to all our guest speakers, and see you in the next SPAFA sesh. Goodbye.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.